Growing up, I always had a huge fascination for werewolves, vampires, and generally all sorts of different creatures of the night. There were a lot of different stories that I got this love from, but I couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed when a movie focused on only one of these things. You're telling me that there's only vampires or only werewolves in this one? And you see, I got into that mindset because of how absolutely spoiled I was with the movie Van Helsing. This was the best picture to me growing up. I got to see Wolverine use all these cool weapons and gadgets and get rid of different monsters, and there were plenty of different monsters, and I just didn't understand what else you could really want from a movie. While the years might not have been super kind to this movie in some regards, I think in other ways the years have actually brought this movie new life. Van Helsing falls under the category of a guilty pleasure movie for me now. This movie does not have a great reputation. The critics absolutely hated it. It only did all right at the box office, but there's also a small pool of fans that either grew up watching this movie like I did, or just enjoy it for what it is. Maybe you, watching this, are part of that pool of people who love this movie, or maybe you're part of the majority that hate this movie. If you are one of those people, you probably aren't gonna like this video very much, because in this video, I'm gonna be recapping the movie Van Helsing, going over the reasons why I love it so much, some of the expanded lore and creatures, and talk about why this movie is an absolute goldmine that no one's really taking advantage of. So grab your automatic crossbows and keep tally of how many different monsters there are as we traverse the dangerous world of Van Helsing.
I'm not gonna like this, am I?
Van Helsing is a story about, well, Van Helsing. He's a monster hunter who's hired by this secret order underneath the Vatican in this alternate Victorian-era inspired world. After taking down Dr. Hyde of the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, Van Helsing gets assigned a new target, Dracula. In the opening of the film, Dracula met with Dr. Frankenstein about needing his monster for an evil master plan that he has, but the townspeople run Frankenstein's monster out of town, and whatever Dracula's plan is was now foiled. The Order tells Van Helsing about a family that is also trying to get rid of Dracula. In fact, several different generations of this family have, but now it's down to just Vulcan and Anna. So Van Helsing gears up with the help of his own Lucius Fox named Carl and heads to Transylvania. Meanwhile, Vulcan and Anna are hunting down a werewolf, and Vulcan shoots it with a silver bullet, but he ends up toppling over the cliff. The people of Transylvania are not too welcoming to Van Helsing, and Anna must be the town mayor or something because she orders them to kill them. But some vampires attack, who don't seem to be wearing clothes that are too weather appropriate, and Van Helsing proves his worth by being the first person to kill a vampire in over 100 years. Dracula is pissed that one of his vampire wives died. Anna and Van Helsing realize that they're on the same side. Vulcan returns to the castle, but is now a werewolf, so Van Helsing has to hunt him down. But Anna convinces him to just capture him, and Van Helsing agrees because it's Kate Beckinsale asking him. We then learn that Vulcan is unwillingly working for Dracula, who's still trying to figure out his evil master plan, and that involves using a werewolf. So Van Helsing and Anna track him down to Castle Frankenstein, finding a bunch of these little gross vampire babies, so of course they wake up and attack the townspeople. Van Helsing takes out as many of them as he can, while Anna goes to find her brother, and Dracula meets with Van Helsing. Dracula seems to know Van Helsing and have this sort of history with him, but Logan can't remember any of that. Vulcan turns into a werewolf and can't leave, Van Helsing and Anna escape, and the vampire babies start popping like balloons, but luckily Carl gets something out of the whole ordeal. Van Helsing and Anna share a semi-romantic moment where the old windmill was burned down, and just as we're getting somewhere, the ground beneath them collapses and they end up in a cave. A cave where Frankenstein's monster lives because he somehow survived. Van Helsing can't kill him because he's not evil and it goes against the rules of the Order, even though he's the key to giving all of Dracula's children eternal life. Vulcan the werewolf also learns that the monster is alive, and Carl finds some sort of werewolf versus vampire prophecy. They enact a plan to get Frankenstein's monster away from Transylvania, but the vampires and the werewolf follow them. Luckily, they were smart enough to use a fake carriage armed with a stake grenade, so that takes care of another vampire, and the silver bullets are enough to take care of Vulcan. But ultimately, their plan to extract Frankenstein fails. Anna gets mad at Van Helsing for killing her brother, but he's pretty pissed too because he got bit. But she's captured by a vampire and brought to Budapest, so the others follow, and Van Helsing suggests a trade. Anna for Frankenstein's monster. So they hide Frankenstein's monster and head to the big royal ball to get Anna back, who's being mind controlled to dance with Dracula. Van Helsing rescues Anna, Frankenstein's monster is captured anyways, and the ball is filled with vampires, so Carl uses one of his gadgets to get rid of them, and they jump into the river to go after Frankenstein's monster, but it's too late. The three of them head back to Anna's castle in Transylvania, putting together all the clues so far, and they find a gateway to Dracula's castle. When they get inside, Frankenstein's monster tells them of a cure for being a werewolf, and Carl realizes that the only thing that can kill Dracula is a werewolf. So they part ways, Van Helsing and Anna finally sharing a nice steamy kiss, Van Helsing going to get Frankenstein's monster, while Anna and Carl go for the cure. Van Helsing ends up facing off against Dracula, Anna fights the third and final vampire, and Carl and Frankenstein fight Igor. Van Helsing turns into a werewolf to kill Dracula, and Anna arrives with the cure, stabbing him with it, but it seems,
In your anger, you killed her.
So Carl and Van Helsing hold a funeral for her, and Van Helsing has some sort of vision in the sky of her and her family reuniting in heaven. Frankenstein's monster rows away, and Carl and Van Helsing ride off into the sunset. Unlike a lot of the videos I do, Van Helsing is not based on a book, at least not one particular book. Just about every character you see in this film is based on one book or another, Van Helsing included. But this story told in this movie is not an adaptation from one specific novel. This movie was directed by Stephen Sommers, who you might know as the director of The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. And if you're a fan of The Mummy, you'll probably notice a lot of similarities between The Mummy and Van Helsing. Both of them lean heavily into their genres, they don't take themselves too seriously, and blend action, horror, and comedy together to create a fun movie. The only difference is that The Mummy is remembered much more fondly than Van Helsing, for some reason. If you're a person who doesn't like this movie but does like The Mummy, could you please tell me why that is, because I'm genuinely curious. Both of these films share the same tone, they have the star power, the same CGI, so is it just the subject matter? I wish I had the answers here, but unfortunately, I don't. This movie does have its fair share of problems. My love for it has not blinded me to those issues. Yes, it relies too heavily on CGI, some of the dialogue isn't the greatest, it's way too over-sexualized, and the plot is a bit confusing. One of the things that has always rubbed me the wrong way is the timeline. We start off in black and white and see Dracula's plan crumble, and then we go to the future, a whole year later in color. Dracula's plan was foiled, but just a year later, he's got this whole different operation up and running. The townspeople are all the same townspeople as they were in the intro. Like, a year is not that long of a time, so the stakes for Dracula just don't seem that heightened. If the intro had happened like 100 years ago, and the time had finally come around again for Dracula to enact his plan, that would make sense, but the whole timeline just seems very odd to me. And there's also stuff like how Dracula doesn't kill anybody other than Dr. Frankenstein in the beginning, and Anna having a sword despite literally not using it at all. Small things like that just kind of bug me. But anyway, this movie was released in 2004 to, like I said, not the highest of praise, and while it did okay at the box office, it wasn't until it was released on DVD that they actually made a lot of their sales. This movie featured a lot of different monsters from properties owned by Universal Studios, and this was really meant to be an homage to those monster movies from the 30s and 40s, which Stephen Sommers' dad must have really liked, and I always thought that this was a really cool thing to add in the credits. So for those creatures of the night, we have Dracula and the vampires, werewolves, Frankenstein's monster, and even Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is actually a strange one, considering Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde wasn't a Universal monster movie. But noticeably absent in this film are the Creature from the Black Lagoon and the Phantom of the Opera. At one point, there were talks to add in the creature from the Black Lagoon in the cave that Frankenstein's monster is hiding in, but they ultimately decided against it. As for the Phantom of the Opera, it kind of would have been hard to incorporate that one into this movie, but Hugh Jackman was actually gonna play the lead character in that movie, but opted to play Van Helsing instead. One thing I have to point out that I absolutely adore in this movie are the werewolves. I have a very special place in my heart for werewolves. They're just my favorite creature of the night, but one thing that always bothers me is when werewolves are shown to just be giant dogs. I love these monstrous looking werewolves, and I think that a lot of that love stems from Van Helsing. Just about every werewolf movie I see, I'm usually disappointed in because I have such a high standard after seeing Van Helsing and Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. The vampires in this movie are pretty goofy, but I think that Richard Roxburgh had a really fun time playing this character, leaning into these goofy moments and just overall having a blast. The other vampires are definitely a product of their time, over-sexualized, and I'm pretty sure they were given no direction on what to be doing when they're in the background of scenes. But anyways, Van Helsing is a total badass. He's like this crossover between Indiana Jones and Batman and all of that during this gothic and Victorian-inspired timeline. All of this movie just seems tailor-made to my liking, which means I probably got a lot of my taste in fantasy from this movie. He's got this insanely badass theme. Seriously, just listen to this. He becomes a badass werewolf and even has a pretty great character arc throughout the film. But this also leads me to my next segment, where a lot of the plot details, specifically those surrounding Van Helsing, are left unanswered. A lot of this comes from the character of Dracula, who seems to know more about Van Helsing than Van Helsing does. For one, he's the only character in the film to call him Gabriel, and throughout their meetings, Dracula reveals a lot of key information. For one, he says that Gabriel is actually the one who killed him in the first place. He calls him the left hand of God, and really highly indicates that he is the archangel, weirdly named Gabriel. But I think the most interesting thing that Dracula brings up is the fact that the Order is supposedly using Van Helsing and his abilities. Dracula says that they're using you just like they once used me. There's an extreme history between these two characters that we never really get to see the full explanation for. But beyond both Dracula and Van Helsing, there's a lot of room for these characters to grow. Frankenstein's monster ends up surviving, rowing himself away to go and live a life of his own. Carl and Van Helsing both going against the wishes of the Order by not killing him, and I would have loved to see where Frankenstein's monster would eventually end up. I feel like a sequel to this movie would have directly related to these consequences, and we'd see more of what this Order was all about, and more of the backstory of Van Helsing and Dracula would have been revealed, and all that leads me to my next point. Initially, this film was supposed to be the first in a series of Van Helsing adventure movies, and also a spin-off TV show called Transylvania. In fact, the studio immediately greenlit a sequel before this movie even came out, refusing to tear down the Transylvania set because they were so sure that they were going to use it again. But when the reviews came out for this film and the box office wasn't where it was supposed to be, these projects were canceled. Since this time, Van Helsing has lived on in a number of ways, just not really in the ways fans of this movie would have liked. In 2009, a reboot was in the works with Guillermo del Toro directing and Tom Cruise starring, but this idea kept on evolving and changing and eventually turned into the Dark Universe, which I'll get to more in a bit, and Tom Cruise instead becoming the lead of The Mummy and not the title character of Van Helsing. There was also a Van Helsing TV show on the Sci-Fi Network about Vanessa Helsing. No, I'm not kidding. It ran for 5 seasons, and I have never heard of it until I was doing research for this video. But recently, an actual Van Helsing reboot was confirmed. There's not really any information on it other than it's currently being written. Some people are lobbying for Hugh Jackman to return, and I think that would be pretty cool if they focus on like his son or grandson and he takes on the mentor role, start up a new trilogy. That could be really cool. And maybe even start up, once and for all, the Dark Universe. If you guys aren't aware, a few years ago, during the height of the MCU, everybody wanted to start their own cinematic universe. And Universal is no different because they tried to get the Dark Universe off the ground and running. They released this photo saying that they're gonna have all these A-listers headline different movies: The Wolfman, The Bride of Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and all of them were gonna tie together, starting with Tom Cruise's The Mummy. Well, that movie flopped even harder than Van Helsing, and Universal was like, you know what, never mind. But outside of the Dark Universe, Universal has had a few movies that have found success, like The Invisible Man and Renfield, which were at some point going to be part of this Dark Universe, but are now their own separate thing. With a new Wolfman movie starring Ryan Gosling on the way, and Van Helsing coming sometime over the next couple years, I still think it's possible that this so-called Dark Universe could work. Maybe they're making all these separate movies to tell their own stories before trying to promise anything. They learned that mistake once before, and if the next slew of movies all work critically and financially, they could eventually tie them all together, and the glue that holds them all together would be Van Helsing. So those are my thoughts on Van Helsing. Let me know your thoughts on the movie and the upcoming reboot. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stuff like this. If you do, then I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.